Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Writer's Edge. I'm your host, Christy Stratus, and tonight we're going to talk about a topic that is always popular and always relevant and ever-changing, the topic of traditional versus indie publishing. So even though we have set topics as always, please do leave your questions in the chat, and I'm going to do my best to get to them and get them answered for you. And if we don't have time for questions, any of your questions, then I will leave them down below after this video, and that way everyone here, all of our participants, can answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel down below, hit the notification bell so you can find out when we are going live or when we have a new video. And I'm really excited to get into this. So first, let's have each of our panelists introduce themselves, and then I'll also introduce myself. So let's start with Kristina.
Hi guys, I'm Kristina Rienzi, suspense author. I have several books out, two of a trilogy with a small press publisher, Crimson Frost Books, and then the rest of my books are indie published. I have everything from psychological thrillers to sci-fi to short stories. And I'm also president of Sisters in Crime New Jersey, so I do have a short story that came out in our 30th anniversary anthology, 30 Shades of Dead. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad you're able to make it. Next is KJ.
Great. Good evening, everyone. And it's KJ Howe here. And my first novel is called The Freedom Broker, about an elite kidnap negotiator. And I'm published under the Hachette umbrella, Kirkus in the US and Headline in the UK. I'm also, in my next book, Skyjack, will be coming out on the second book in the series next April. And I'm also the executive director of Thrillerfest, which is the premier thriller conference. And about 1,000 people descend on New York City every July to celebrate. And this year we'll be having George R.R. Martin as our special guest.
That
so
is really fun.
Winter is coming in July.
That is awesome. Thank you so much for being here. And next we have Joshua.
Hey everybody, my name is Joshua Robertson. I am an international award-winning author in epic fantasy. I'm best known for my Thrice Nine Legends saga, including my Blood of Dragons series. I also write dark fantasy and the occasional horror or historical fiction. I have a number of publications completed, including 5 full-length novels and about 7 short stories. I have 5 or 6 releases coming up in the next 6 months or so. I did own my own small press for several years, where I published underneath my own imprint, but I would probably be considered now more self-published. My plan is to eventually move towards traditional publishing or to a larger publishing house in the next couple of years.
Great, thank you. And we finally have Edward.
Hi, my name's Ed Willett. I'm the author of some 60 books of both nonfiction and fiction. Most of those would be traditionally published. My major publisher is Daw Books in US. Oh, look, I have my latest book right here. The Cityborn, which just came out in July, is my latest one. And I have 2 more books coming out from Daw that are contracted already to start a new series, which will be starting up next year. So largely on the traditional side, although I have self-published a couple of things, and I actually have a illustrated poetry manuscript in the works and a collection of my short fiction, which I hope to put out in the next year, and I'll probably be self-publishing those. So I've kind of got a foot in both camps, but I'm primarily a traditionally published author.
Great. Glad you were able to make it here. And I'm Christy Stratus. I'm the author of the Dark Victoriana collection, which includes Anatomy of a Darkened Heart and Lock and Key. I'm also on Wattpad with a couple of short stories on there. Most of my writing is dark, but of course the Dark Victoriana collection is my main collection, and I have them right here. So definitely check them out on Amazon. And I am participating in NaNoWriMo, much like many people. So you can check out my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Christy Stratus, and I do NaNoWriMo vlogs there. All right, so let's get right into this. Let's start out with what kind of experience you have, because actually you guys have pretty much mentioned this already, which I really appreciate. I was going to ask, do you have experience in both indie and indie or self-publishing and traditional publishing, or just one? But I think most of you actually already answered that, which is great. So instead, let's have each of you tell us why you chose the route that you mainly publish in. And anybody can just jump right in.
Well, I guess I'll start. When I started self-publishing wasn't really an option. I've been writing professionally since the 90s, was when my first books came out. And it wasn't really, I mean, traditional was all there was. So naturally, that's what I was focused on. And of course, when I grew up, I was reading all the great science fiction fantasy authors, and they were all from, publishers like Daw and Doubleday and people like that. So that was just naturally the way that I tended when I came out. So that's why I went and took the traditional route, because I'm really old.
For myself, I want to make it somewhere. Is it mine? For myself, I started actually when I was really young. I finished my first novel when I was 17, and I had an agent, and query letters went out, and I kind of had my first foot in the water in traditional publishing. But I ended up going to college right after high school and lost contact with the agent. And then for like the next 10 years, I just got bombarded with all these vanity press offers, which I completely ignored because I had been given some guidance to do that. But it kind of put a bad taste in my mouth, I think, for traditional publishing, even though they themselves weren't necessarily traditional publishing. And so about the age of 30, I started up my own small press and learned all that I could and just went off from there. I definitely have, I think, a lot of respect for traditional publishing and what it has to offer. And the more that I get into the field, the more I realize there's a lot of things in traditional publishing that I myself don't know that I have the time or patience to learn about. So I do self-publishing now, and it's great, and it's a great venue. I love the freedom that it offers, but there's definitely things with traditional publishing that are attractive to me, which I'm sure we'll get into in a little bit.
Sure. So it's KJ here, and I just wanted to say that I'm traditionally published, and I'm a former medical writer, and I went back into my master's in creative writing, and I also studied at a few retreats. And at one of those retreats, I was lucky enough to have Karen Slaughter as my teacher. And Karen kindly introduced me to her agent. And so that's how I ended up traditionally published, luckily enough to be signing with her agent. I think there are benefits to both sides of it, and I'm really looking forward to exploring them tonight. But I just had this dream of holding a hardcover in my hands all my life, and I'm really honored and happy that it came true.
And jump in. I wouldn't consider, and I know we talked about this a little bit before, we were kind of chatting about this, and we'll probably get into it a little bit more later. I have a small press as my first book was published under a small press, which I don't consider traditionally published. I consider it a little bit more in the indie, even though it's not my own company, only because I feel like they do a lot of things. Now that I know what it's like to be published indie, I feel like they're doing a lot of things that I would do from an indie standpoint. But anyway, I went down that road of pitching to a publisher initially because all my friends were traditionally published and had agents, and I thought that that was the route to go down, and I was a little bit nervous about doing the indie thing. I didn't know what that all entailed. So my first books were published through a small press, and I have published several books since then on my own. I opened up my own little mini press as well, which again I considered all of this to be in the indie realm. However, I do always have a book in the hopper that I'm pitching to agents and editors, and I think like everybody on the panel will probably get into, there's a benefit to both sides, and I believe I'll probably always explore both sides because I think there's a little there are pros and cons to both. So I don't know that I would ever shut any of them out, but yeah, I think we'll get into that on the panel.
Definitely. And like you were saying, we were just talking right before this started, Joshua brought up a great topic, which is what is the difference? Because we may all have different definitions of what is traditional. Traditional publishers have small imprints that you may not even realize are part of the traditional publisher, and some people may consider those small presses. So actually, I'd love to get that topic started with Joshua because he has a lot of experience in this particular topic.
Sure, I'd love to talk about it, but by all means, everyone else on the panel jump in and correct me where I may be wrong. From my understanding, we oftentimes try to splice it between traditional publishing and independent publishing. And I've heard the argument that traditional publishing is like the big five, and then everything outside of that is considered to be independent publishing. But I've had a lot of conversations with people that are in small presses or mediocre presses that don't perceive it that way. They perceive their press as being traditional publishing because they're following a traditional model. They're not outsourcing for editors or outsourcing for graphic designers. They have their own department set up within their publishing house, and they're not relying on a bigger publishing company but they're following a pretty strict pattern of how they're publishing. They have their acquisitions editors, they're churning stuff out through a slush pile, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really comes down to, do we have independent publishers, self-publishers, vanity publishers, and then is there traditional publishing, which I think is usually the 4 or 5 breakdown that I see. You have your traditional, your small press, and then which are independent publishers, and then self-publishers and vanity. So, but by all means, correct me on that on where you see it wrong. But I know that I see a lot of people say, I'm traditionally published because we follow the traditional model. We just don't have a big publishing house backing us.
Yeah, I could maybe talk about that a minute, because although DAW is my big New York publisher, I've had a lot of books published through smaller presses, which I consider traditional publishing, even though they are very small. One of them is Cato Books here in Regina, Saskatchewan, where I live, which is a very well-respected literary publisher. They follow the traditional model, but at the same time, they are outsourcing cover design and editors and things like that. And yet they're sold through bookstores in the traditional fashion. And some even smaller presses I've worked with as well. I think of that as traditional publishing. When I think of indie publishing, I usually think of presses that are probably focused very much on the ebook market, less than on print, perhaps. And,
or even on print on demand, maybe.
Yeah, or print on demand. Whereas the traditional are, maybe that's the distinction, is that traditional publishers are printing their books and stockpiling them and selling them, as opposed to print on demand or an ebook first mindset.
Yeah, those are really good points. And I think that the whole print on demand thing, that's a really good point between the both of you, that definitely traditional publishers don't do that. So that's definitely a defining factor. Okay. So then I have another question for you guys. Are there any genres that you think would be more successful, or specifically successful, easier to publish in the traditional realm or the indie realm? Is there anything in particular, or why would you think that that genre would be easier to publish one route or the other, or better to publish one route or the other?
When it comes to romances, I think that's a great place for indie publishing, because romance readers are incredibly voracious. And so the timeline of getting a traditional book out is usually, you know, a year to 18 months, sometimes even longer. And I think that to, you know, feed the incredible desire for books, and especially in the romance genre, I think it's a great idea to have a lot of them indie published. And I have several friends who are very, very successful romance authors who do indie publish very successfully.
I think that's a really good point. Anything where you can, where readers are really craving, you know, I want to read a book in a week. Like, there are certain genres that I think lend themselves to that more than others. Like, let's say if you're doing contemporary literature or literary fiction, people don't expect that of you. But if you're doing like some other genres, they would really expect to see something every 6 months or maybe sooner. Like, the more you can hand it to them, the faster they're going to read it.
Exactly.
I absolutely agree. I just wanted to jump in. The romance is a place where when you self-publish, there's such a great chance of you, if you're putting books out quickly, to build that readership. There's there is a readership out there already looking for those and to devour them. I also think if you're an author who regularly crosses genres, or writes in multiple genres, or writes things that don't exactly fit on a shelf in a bookstore, it is probably a better opportunity for you to at least begin through the indie publishing world, because I find it a little bit more difficult to get a sell through a bigger publisher, but they're looking for to bucket you. And things have changed over the years where I think that there's a little bit more flexibility, but there still is sort of a shelf that they have to call your book something. Is it romance? Is it mystery? Is it suspense? Is it fantasy? And if you think your book is fantasy, but they're saying it's romance, like this, I think this happened with actually the popular Outlander series, where she considered her books fantasy, and they really marketed them as romance, and it took off, and they were able to do that. But I think just people who are used to indie publishing and sort of calling their book with the strongest genre genre they feel it is, or creating a new genre or cross genre. Having to bucket it, to sell it may be a little bit more difficult. So yeah, definitely romance and books or authors that tend to jump genres. And while I write suspense, I do tend to do that. I write a little bit in all the areas. So it's a little bit harder to market somebody like me who will write horror and sci-fi and mainstream thriller and domestic thriller and romantic suspense and all those kinds of things. And then I'll throw in a cozy mystery or some nonfiction. So it's a little bit harder for that.
I want to build on that just with one point. This is something that I learned from the agent that I had early on in my career. Is she took me to a bookstore, had me sit down there in a Barnes & Noble and drink a coffee, and she said, Josh, look around the bookstore at what sections are the largest sections that are sitting here, because that's where the market is at. If you're writing books that are in the small sections of those bookstores, there's probably a good chance you're not going to get them accepted, which steered me away from publishing my poetry. I had somewhere between 100 and 200 poems done by the time I was 17 that I was looking at getting published. And she sat me down, she said, look at that poetry section. Your poems are never going to get published. It's just not going to happen. Now you can go self-publish them if you want to, but they're not going to get picked up that well. Look at the sections that have a large audience, and that's what you need to be writing in if you want to be traditionally published.
It's a really good point. And also I was going to say that a book like Diana Gabaldon's Outlander, if you think about that, that crosses so many different genres, from time travel to romance to historical. And it's very difficult to get those kind of books published because the marketing teams at traditional publishers want to kind of pigeonhole you into a certain subgenre so you can be on Barnes & Noble shelves and such. And so I think it's a real challenge if you want to do a multi-genre book or something different. Diana broke through with a phenomenal series, but I don't think it's very easy to do. So I think that's something that would lend itself well to indie publishing because the marketing people really do want to know if your book is a thriller, a romance, sci-fi.
Yeah, and if they can't slot you in there, it can hurt the book a little bit. I had as E.C. Blake, which is one of my pseudonyms for DAW, I wrote a trilogy called The Masks of Agrima, Masks, Shadows, and Faces. And it's a 15-year-old female protagonist. And I always thought of it as a YA book, but DAW doesn't have a YA line. So it got published in the adult fantasy market as an adult fantasy, and yet it has this 15-year-old protagonist. We tried to get some of that crossover stuff happening, but looking at reviews, one of the things that happened was that people would say, well, this is really YA. I don't read YA. Why am I reading this? And then because I wrote it without thinking of as a YA, knowing it was going into the adult market, other people read it and thought, oh, this is a horrible book. You should never give a teenager this book. This is like the filthiest book they haven't read Game of Thrones, obviously. But they thought it was the filthiest book they'd ever read and things like that. So those genres seem restrictive a little bit, but at the same time, they do help readers know what to expect when they find it. And that's why traditional publishers really do want to slot you into those categories.
And just to add into what Edward was saying, I think, another thing I've heard just from friends who are traditionally published as well is there's fierce competition in the traditional world. I mean, there really is between getting an agent and getting published, and so should there be. But with that being said, when you do have a book that is maybe you're calling it your traditional sci-fi, and you're trying to get that sci-fi, agent or publisher there, there's competition. And so, you are going up against some big names in those genres. And so, there's that too, where it's not to discourage you from pitching to agents and everything, because wait, you finally have that mainstream thriller or that mainstream sci-fi. But absolutely there are, people have gone before us that, have a lot of the pull and the market, and again, so should they, because of the sales, where you still are going to kind of need to break through in a way that's a little different. So it can't be exactly like the ones that went before you, but enough that they know where to put you on a shelf, but a little bit different enough where you stand out. So it is tough all around, and certainly, for me, something I'll always strive for. But I do love the ability to be able to indie publish and entertain readers in the meantime.
Yeah, and just to throw in there, when we're talking about cross-genre things like Outlander, like KJ mentioned, one of the things, it's interesting because cross-genre can be very popular because there's just so much that you can appreciate in a book, and a reader gets a little bit of everything. But at the same time, It can be difficult, of course, with what we were saying with publishers. It can be difficult if you're self-publishing to really pin it on Amazon. That can be tough. But it's also very tough to enter into any kind of contest, because you can usually, I mean, sometimes you can enter multiple categories, but there isn't like a cross category that will work. And so when judges read your book and it's cross genre like that, man, can that be difficult. It's not going to match up to like what's expected of a typical mystery or a typical fantasy or something like that. So that is something to think about if you want to submit to contests. Just a random side note there. We do have a question from Antonio. Thank you, Antonio, for asking this. He says, can both sides comment on barriers for entry on both types of publishing? I know they are vastly different. That's why I ask. And I think we did a little bit of that, but maybe we could deal with it more specifically.
I can talk a little bit about the traditional side, because I've asked my editor, Sheila Gilbert at DAW, once, you know, how many manuscripts do they get in a month? And DAW is one of the few publishers that actually takes full manuscripts. We'll look at full manuscripts, not just, you know, a query letter and then asking for more after that. And she said it's harder to tell now because they do get more submissions as opposed to, you know, the actual mailed manuscripts. But still, there's something like 500 manuscripts coming to them every month. And they publish, I think, typically 4 books a month, of which you can expect a couple of them are probably part of ongoing series or established authors. So that's the kind of odds you're up against in any traditional publishing house. They're just literally swamped with stuff. Now, having said that, the way I got in was kind of weird, because they picked up my book from a small publisher because they had a hole in their publishing schedule, which indicates that, to me, that out of all those hundreds of manuscripts, they still didn't have anything they thought was publishable. So if you're good, that's usually the first thing to break through that level, is you just have to be, you have to be a good writer. And that, you know, that goes for anything. If you're going to sell as an indie writer, it certainly helps if you can actually write. But yeah, that's the kind of numbers you're looking at in the traditional world.
I think some of the barriers to self-publishing. Oh, sorry. Did you want to go, KJ?
No, please go ahead. All about you.
I don't think oftentimes we talk about the barriers of self-publishing. It looks like it's just a really quick, you know, I put a manuscript together, I throw it up there, and it's out publicly to the world. But there are tons of barriers to self-publishing. I think we have a question that we're going to talk about, essentially, of the pros and cons. And can a self-publisher do whatever a traditional publisher can? And the short answer is no, and the long answer is yes. If you take the time to learn everything, you can do what traditional publishers can do. But there is so much when it comes down to foreign rights and first rights sellings and getting your information marketed over into other countries and getting licensing deals and learning how to get your books into wide distribution and being able to put it you know, into warehouses and stuff like that, and the return rates that come back on books that you get into bigger places. There's tons and tons of information out there about how to actually make it work. And if you're going to go the self-publishing or the indie route with that, you have to learn how to do those types of things if you really want to make it big as an indie author, I think. Go ahead, KJ.
Yeah, very good points. And I think, you know, in the traditional world, we have an event called Pitch Fest at Thrillerfest, and that's where we have 60 agents come and listen to aspiring authors pitch. And we have a lot of wonderful success stories coming from that. But after talking to the different agents and hearing what they receive as well, like just like the other gentleman was saying, you know, at the end of the day, what we have is they have hundreds of manuscripts coming over the transom all the time, especially with the way e-submissions are welcome now. And so what they're trying to do is to, you know, like go through them and find gems, hidden gems. So the best thing you can do is write the best incredible book, storytelling book that you can, that'll get you through. But the first, you know, barrier is getting an agent, because quite often these larger, you know, traditional publishing firms really won't look at your stuff. Once in a while they'll have a pizza party and go through the slush pile, and that's, you know, people that are unagented that are submitting. But in general, most of the people are submitting via agent. And even then, it does depend on your agent and their contacts. For example, if your agent has a fantastic relationship with certain editors and knows their taste, they're much more likely to read that book because they know it's sort of being tailored for them. So it's just really tricky, because there's kind of a two-tiered system that you have to get. You know, if you want to get across that moat into the castle, you know, you have to really work hard to get an agent on your side and then an editor.
Although if you're lucky enough to sell without an agent, it's really easy to get an agent, which is what happened to me. Is that's basically, I called up my agent, Ethan Ellenberg, and I said, "Hi, I have a contract. Would you like 15% of it?" And he said, "Sure." And they're really, really easy to get an agent if you have a contract already in hand. And then he helps you going forward.
And I just want to add one more barrier to the indie publishing that we don't always take into account is money. It's not cheap to publish a book and to publish a book well. And so, obviously, even with a small press, you're not paying, they're paying you. And I mean, that would, that's the whole point of not doing the vanity publishing. But when you're your own press, you have to pay a cover artist, you have to pay an editor, and a good editor is very costly. And a lot of times, you're like, I'm looking for the editors that are, the editors that I've been trying to use are the ones that are the freelancers on the side from publishing houses. So that you're getting the quality you would get at a more traditional publishing house, and or you're using people that you know and trust in the business. And so those are developing relationships and over time and feedback. So there's the time and energy, absolutely. You're going to put it in with I think with any, traditional publishing arrangement, you're going to put the time and energy in also. But I think when you're sort of, and it's your business and you're an authorpreneur, as I like to say, there's all of the business acumen, the energy, the time, and the money. And again, it is not, it's free to upload your book online, but to get it to the point where it's uploadable and readable costs money.
I have to add one more thing before you go on, Christy, and that is, as an indie publisher, you also have to deal with the barrier of the stigma. Oftentimes we've seen self-publishing be rephrased or coined as indie publishing to try to get rid of that negative stigma of self-published. And I've seen this at book fairs, I've seen this at signings where people come up and go, "Did you self-publish these?" And if you say yes, they just walk away from the table. They don't want to touch it with a 10-inch pole because it's or a 10-foot pole because it's been self-published and they don't have the same value for it as traditional published. I wrote an article on this actually for Fantasy Faction. I don't know how well received it was, but I talked a lot about how we went from early 2000s of having about 80,000 novels published a year in the United States. Now in 2017, we have over 1 million novels published every year in the United States. It's extremely saturated, and most of those are indie published books, which I seen again, a post the other day where a guy said he can't find a book that's not indie published, and he's just stopped reading because of that, because he can't find good published works. And so there's a stigma there that you have to overcome, and you have to essentially have quality content that you can put next to your name and be proud of, and it can be accepted by the reading community.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I wanted to add on to something Kristina said as well, which is it's not the cost of actually putting up an ebook. A lot of times when somebody hasn't published yet and they ask me, how much does it cost to put it on Amazon, to put it on, Barnes & Noble or something like that. And I always have to say, like, it's not that, it's everything else that costs you. So I think that's a common misconception when people are just starting. We have another great question in the chat, and that is from Joe. Joe from Go Indie Now. What do you envy about the other side's publishing methods? It's a pretty cool one.
As a mostly traditionally published, I envy the complete freedom to write any idea that you have that you want to pursue. The Masks trilogy that I mentioned previously came about because I sent probably a dozen novel ideas to my agent, and he focused on that one. He said, "Let's pursue that one." And I guess he was right, because it sold. But I still have those other 10 sitting there, which I would really like to write. They're all great ideas, I think. But I don't have a traditional publisher for them. And I'm focused, of course, on what I'm contracted to do. So I think that's what and whenever I think of maybe I'd like to do more of that, that's where the appeal to that side of it comes in for me.
Let me just jump in for 1 second, because you said something that and then everybody else can answer, but I just wanted to ask you, Ed, does it say anything, I don't know if this is too much about, but I wondered, in a contract, like if you publish indie, if you want to publish indie, do you have to put that in your contract? Is that even possible? Is it like breaking a contract if you were to decide to, look, I really want to put one thing out by myself?
No, I'm not locked into the contract in that way. It would be if I wanted to publish, well, and even like there was a 4th book for the Masks trilogy, and they didn't want it. which means it's free. If I wanted to, I can write that fourth book and put it out myself. And I write for a number of different publishers, and I've never seen anything that's restrictive. Sometimes there's like a right of first refusal on your next related project. So if I have a big science fiction book that's suitable for DAW, I will show it to them first. But I do that anyway because they're my big publisher, and I want them to publish my stuff more than anybody else. So yeah, no, if I put something out myself, it doesn't really affect what I'm putting out for somebody else unless there's something it's very closely related to that particular publisher's project.
What do you guys envy about the other side?
For me, I would say the speed, the turnaround time. You know, it's so fantastic because if you're a prolific writer and you can produce, you know, a book, usually in the traditional thriller genre, for example, it's a book a year that they want to put out. But if you're able to write 2 or 3 books, you know, now things are slightly changing, and some authors like Brad Taylor and David Baldacci, they are putting out 2 books a year, but it's a big grind. You know, it takes a lot of time to get the artwork done, to get, you know, the editing done, and to do the marketing and have the sales force go out and sell the book in traditional. So I find that is really very time consuming, and I think the indie speed is fantastic, and it's really nice to be able to write something and see it in print, especially if you're telling a story that could be time sensitive, you know, due to news events or anything like that.
I think that on our side of things, for self-indie, in terms of what we are maybe jealous about or envious about on the traditional side, there are a couple of things. One, the connections. Trying to make connections with people that can distribute books and push things out there and get your books in the right places is very hard from an indie perspective. I mean, you're just standing there like, please look at me, and, you know, screaming at anybody that will listen, just hoping that you can get your break type of thing. And sometimes that break never comes. So I think that's a big piece of it. But I also think that we idolize traditional publishing, that we see a lot of security in that. And I don't know whether or not that's true or not, but traditional publishing seems to have this security, like you have your royalty checks and you have your upfront, you know, payments before you write the story, and you're kind of situated financially and steadily, so you can just sit back and worry about writing and not a whole lot else. And I don't think that's entirely true. I think that traditional publishers have a lot more that they have on their plate that they have to deal with. But from an indie perspective, I know a lot of indie authors just idolize or fantasize how wonderful that traditional life is.
So I definitely agree with Josh in a sense that there are some things that you think go on that you don't know if they really do or not, and then you talk to different people and find out, like, for some people they do and for some people they don't. But certainly, like, for me, it would be, I always call it street cred, like that kind of, like, to be able to say, like, oh, I have such and such agent and I have this publisher. Like, in order to have that, people know you did the work. They know that you're a good writer. They know that you've kind of crossed that threshold. It's a lot harder to prove yourself from an indie standpoint in the marketplace unless you're selling, you know, hundreds of thousands of books a month. Like, it's just more difficult to get your name out there and be able to prove your worth. And I think when you immediately hear an agent's name that you know or a publisher that you know come out of someone's mouth, you're like, oh, cool. Like, there's a little level of like that, like climbing the ladder in the literary world, which I absolutely, I think, you know, there's a piece of all of us that want that. Also the reach, you know, the reader reach, you know, they just can reach more readers. Even if you're low on the totem pole, the reach is greater than many of us. Although we've come a long way in the indie world, I think that absolutely the traditional reach is beyond what, you know, we can do by ourselves, at least in the beginning. And for me, and I've seen a little bit of this with my small press, just because I tend to have my hands in a million pots and I'm always working on like 3 stories at once, or I have all these ideas and I just want to, like, okay, you're handling that book, great, that's fantastic. Let me move on to this one. Like, tell me when I need to do the edits because I'm already on the plot for the next story. And so I like the idea of knowing, like, somebody's working on it. I don't have to go out and find my editor and find my cover art. Like, I'm involved in the process because it's still a small enough publisher. But I don't, like, I care more about the story, but I'm like, oh, great, you're handling that. That's awesome. Tell me what I need to do. What's my deadline? Like, I just feel like it's structured and I love that. I love getting jobs. Like, if they say, like, you need to do, I set up a blog tour. Here's where you're going to be. Awesome. And then I can work on my indie stuff, and I always have something in the hopper. And I'll deal with that on my own. But I like the idea that there's a book working for me in the background with somebody, and then I can focus on the next thing. So, and I know that, friends of mine that have those traditional contracts and are putting out several books and have them ongoing, and they're really just handing in a proposal versus the whole story. Which again, I've also found with even with my small press, like if there's a follow up to one of my stories, or if I'm working on like a spinoff, it's like, well, just send me the blurb, and that's fine. We'll get started on it. So there's a little bit of that security where it's like, this is working for me on the side. And then I can just focus on the stuff that I want to do independently. So I would like a little bit more of that. That would be nice.
100% agree.
Just wanted to mention too, in my role at Thrillerfest, I have the opportunity to talk to a lot of authors, both indie and traditionally published. And I can tell you that a lot of the traditionally published authors are still feeling insecure because, publishing is such a bottom line business, and, book sales go up and down, and I have several friends, who contract have been canceled or dropped due to poor sales, and they're really looking at the bottom line. So just wanted to, share with you that it's not, nirvana in that sense that, I think in both, forms, self or traditional, you really need to take responsibility as an author to get your name out there, to work really hard at marketing, because even in the traditional world, if you're not selling well, it's not, sadly, they don't have the funds, the energy, and the effort now to build authors over like 5 to 8 books, which they used to do. I remember when Lee Child and Michael Connolly started, I've spoken to people, and if you look at their sales records, I mean, obviously astronomical now, but when they first started, they were building and people were just discovering them. And so it took a few books for them to really catch on, which is normal because, people discover and they say, have you read so-and-so? These days, publishers are less tolerant of that. And if you're not building fast, you may end up getting dropped.
Thank you for bringing that up. That's a really good point, and one that, I think everyone in the indie world just sort of, for the most part, assumes, like you said, it's got to be more secure. So thank you for saying that. And actually, that's a perfect lead into our next question, which is in the chat, which is something I wanted to know anyway. You guys are coming up with awesome questions. Thank you. This one is from Rebecca, and she says, I'd like to know if traditional publishing actually does take care of the marketing and advertising. We've had a lot of people responding to that in the chat, so I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say about it.
Well, yes, to a certain extent. DAW is under the Penguin Random House umbrella, and so my last book, The Cityborn, had a publicist assigned to it, and she did a very good job, and she had, like 300 different online places that she was reaching out to and sending out review copies and all that sort of thing. And yet at the same time, I made a point recently of bringing on an outside publicist as well, Mickey Mickelson from the Creative Edge, and because you can always do more, and you never get, even though I felt like I had really great publicity from Penguin Random House, really this time around, you never feel like you have enough. But yes, they do some, at least.
I would disagree with Edward too. I think that I have an in-house publicist and marketing manager, and they've been incredibly supportive and wonderful. But I sort of feel like as an author these days, no matter where you're published, you need to take responsibility for your career and really work hard on getting the word out. And I have definitely worked with outside publicists as well. And I've invested, most of my advance in getting the word out about the book, because I sort of look at it as an investment in the future.
And you still have to do all that online, that we all do. I was a journalism major, and one of my classes was from public relations, and the only thing I remember from my public relations class is that 90% of public relations is wasted, but nobody knows which 90% it is. So that's why we all do so much and try to do so many different things.
Story of my life.
Actually, since we're on the topic, this is a perfect time to ask. I would like to ask both sides. How do you feel about, but I think this especially applies to the traditional side, but I want to know from both sides, Do you ever feel limited? Like, would you feel limited with a traditional publisher, with an indie publisher, with no publisher? How limited do you feel in what you can say publicly, like on social media channels? I don't know. Some people get sort of political. Some people, I don't know, will maybe swear or something like that. And so I wondered, for those of you who are representing your publisher, how limited that is if they're watching that kind of thing, and if you can, I don't know, suffer for that. And on the indie side, how careful are you just for your own reputation and building yourself, or, you know, because everything is really marketing yourself all the time.
Nobody wants to say anything.
I can definitely start with it, but I mean, I am kind of my own boss at this point. So what I put out there is definitely up to me. I don't have anybody overseeing that and looking at it. I know this past year has definitely been a challenge in seeing what is pushed out across social media from people much more famous than any of us sitting here, I'm sure, and the reprimand that they get for doing that, whether we're looking at actors or we're looking at celebrities or spokesmen of anything, even outside of the writing world. And so that itself is pretty terrifying. I know that I've been outspoken on politics and stuff like that before in social media. I don't know that it's impacted my sales or my reputation at all. I'm sure there are readers that distance themselves a little bit during those times where I'm like, okay, I got to talk about this. But for the most part, I think indie are pretty open to saying what they want to say, and there's people that respect that. I personally buy from authors that are outspoken. I love Mike Cole, who's outspoken. I love R.A. Salvatore, who's outspoken. Even if I don't agree with what they say, I like that they take their humanity first, and they care about the world and the people in it, and they're willing to speak out against it instead of their brand and how they're making money. And so I'll buy their books just because they're willing to step up and be a human first, as long as they're respectful about it.
No, I agree with Joshua. Go ahead, Christina.
Oh, no, go ahead. You go.
I was just going to say that I think it's just really important to be yourself on social media. You know, my marketing manager and publicist, you know, encourage to stay away from hot topics, of course, because, you know, it's very divisive. I'm Canadian, so I haven't really been involved in the political situation down in the U.S. But I just think it's really important to talk about things that matter to you, and it comes across as genuine if you're really talking about things that are genuinely interesting. Like, for example, my character has diabetes, and you know, I feel really strongly about educating people on diabetes, and so that's something that I really am keen on. And I think people feel that, you know, the authenticity of the social media out there.
I just wanted to marry what both KJ and Josh were saying, in that I think we are our brands. You know, our name, our face, everything we do is our brand. And people are going to buy books, not just because we write great books and tell great stories, but because they like who we are. And just like Josh said, he reads people who are outspoken, who say the things that he's so proud that they're able to say and they have the courage to say. And I tend to gravitate towards authors who, you know, have the attitude and not necessarily viewpoints, but have the personality and have the likes, you know, of the things that I enjoy. And there's a diversity in there too. Like, you also want to read the people who are completely different from you, like what makes them tick. But at least that's how I look at it. But yeah, I think being your authentic self, being the version of yourself that they would meet if they saw you in person. Like, I'm no different, and Christy has met me in person, so she can vouch for this. I am no different online than I am in person at all. There's nothing about my posts, about my video, about my blogs, about my books that's anything different, except for the murder. I don't do that because that's all fiction. But there's nothing about any of that. That's not who I truly am and the things I believe in. And I think as long as you're true to that, that you will find the readers that are meant for you. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of a comfort level for different people. When I was a newspaper author, I had a columnist. As newspaper columnist, I had a column, and I was way more outspoken in print as when I was writing for a newspaper. Now I find I'm just not interested in doing that. I'm much more interested in talking about the things that I think that do interest me, which tend to be science and things about writing and editing and stuff like that. I live in Canada too. I'm actually a dual citizen, so I get a little bit, and I have so many friends from so many different directions, and I don't I don't feel that my political opinions are going to sway anybody's opinion, or that they're really worth sharing. I would rather talk about things that I think are more important than political opinions, actually. Whether it would affect me with my publisher or not, I don't know, because it's be so unlike me to ever get into that position. I don't think it would ever come up. And that's also who I am in person. So I guess I am being myself online as well. I'm just not somebody who gravitates to talking about religion and politics and all that sort of stuff, even in social settings.
Yeah, this is something that was recently on a Publishers Weekly article about a lot of majorly popular, traditionally published authors, and especially YA authors, who are being very vocal about on politics in particular, and who can draw hate because of it, and really you can draw hate for anything you say, really, but B, also sway their followers, which is just an interesting topic to hit on. So I'm glad that we got the chance to talk about that. I also wanted to know, along the same lines, sort of, from both sides, there's a whole movement sort of around making sure, or should you make sure, or does it matter, or anything like that, including diversity, which can mean any number of things in a book. And there are some people who are on the side of we have to make an effort to be super diverse and include different ethnicities, different traditions, different everything. Let me think, different sexual orientations, and all kinds of things. And then there are people that are on the side of let's just write the story, and it doesn't really matter at all. And I wondered if there's any pressure on any of you, or do you feel like you have to do anything like that, or whether it behooves you to do it with a traditional publisher or as a self-published person, as comments from your readers, maybe.
It hasn't really come up in my stuff because so much of it is straight ahead fantasy or science fiction. So if you have characters of different skin color or different cultures, they may be alien cultures, and the skin color may be green. So it doesn't really, I've never felt any pressure to do that. I will occasionally make an effort, especially with things that are set in the future. I try to get away from my default names for characters, which naturally tend to be sort of white bread Canadian, Saskatchewan, European background sort of thing, and Texas before that. So I will try to come up with more interesting names, just to indicate that all of the cultures of the Earth have made their way out into the universe. So I do that in science fiction, but I've never felt any particular pressure from anybody to do it.
I would echo that. I don't think I've ever felt pressure from somebody else to write issues like that in my stories, and I write fantasy, so I got blue guys and red guys and different stuff too. But with my background, which I've talked about before, I got a master's in social work with minors in psychology and sociology. I worked in social services for 15 years as a therapist and a behavior specialist, and I worked with children in sync cases and all sorts of different things. But I really feel like I have a need personally to put societal issues in my book. So I do touch on things like racism and war and sexism and ageism and all these different types of things, and I put it between the different characters in my books. I also like to deal with mental illness with my characters and the way that they deal with things like schizophrenia and addiction and self-harm and mutilation, those types of stuff as well. So I have those things tailored in there, but nobody's asking me to do it. It's my own legacy, and it's something that I want to reflect on because it's what we deal with in today's world. Which I've said before, fantasy is like the place where you can talk about anything in fantasy and it's suddenly acceptable. Like if you were to write this in a romance novel or a thriller, you'd probably get some pretty harsh slaps on the wrist. But you can talk about anything in sci-fi and fantasy, and it's like a buffer. People just allow you to talk about it because it's a made-up world. Maybe that's my own perception, but I see that done a lot. It's like it allows you to kind of push things into people's minds easily without forcing it on them.
Well, I think that's one of the functions of science fiction and fantasy. Specifically, yes. That's why one reason we don't all write it. That's why some of us write it.
Yeah, which we're not going to tell anybody, because if they catch on.
From my perspective, my books are inherently diverse. When I grew up, my father worked in telecommunications, and so I lived all around the world, in Africa and Saudi Arabia and Puerto Rico and all over. And the reason I chose kidnapping as a topic, and I was immersed in it for the last 4 years, is because I really wanted to write international thrillers with a huge diverse cast of characters. And so each and every story that I write about Thea Paris, she'll be traveling to different parts of the world, because there are so many different kidnapping hot zones. So from that perspective, absolutely very, very diverse books. And as Joshua was saying too, I'm fascinated by psychology, and I do include a lot of, sort of insights into the human mind and personality disorders, mental illnesses and such into the books as well. I think it's just fascinating, and I hope that the reader enjoys learning about them as well.
Christy, you put together a great panel, because I feel like everybody is like speaking my language here with my master's in psychology and working with mentally ill. It's definitely, it comes out in my books as well. I think I tend to write things that in terms of the characters and diversity, what I'm comfortable writing, what I feel like I can do justice to. And so I do my best with that. And yeah, I mean, I certainly have never felt pressure. I feel like I write what the story dictates and what I'm comfortable writing. And I don't ever want to write something that I don't think I could do a good job with. And so I will lean toward the areas that I'm comfortable with. And obviously I let my story, tell me what is needed there. And we are very lucky to live on the East Coast in the United States, in a very diverse area. I've grown up with all different cultures, and I've seen a lot. So I feel very comfortable with and with that aspect. But I just, whenever I'm writing something, I want to make sure that it's going to be accurate and authentic, and from from a perspective I feel like I can give. So, but from on the diversity standpoint as well, I think that really promoting authors who have those diverse backgrounds, who can speak to these things, who have those experiences, and having like KJ was saying, she's been all over the world. I mean, those are important things, because to me it's there's the creativity aspect, and then there's the realism aspect, the ability to just pull from your life experiences, and I think that really gives an authenticity to the story. So as long as we're doing that, and we're trying to find the diversity in our world, and making sure we're highlighting it, and we're sort of celebrating those people who do a good job at that, I think that we there's only good can come from that, opening our eyes to whether it be a fantasy world or a different part of the world that truly exists, or a different way of life. I mean, those are all really interesting and entertaining for the reader.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. That was I'm glad that you guys were able to answer with so much detail, because I find that to be a very interesting topic, and it's heavily talked about now. We have a question in the chat from Amber. What kind of control do traditionally published authors have over their book covers?
That varies a lot from publisher to publisher, and it has varied for me from publisher to publisher. DAW is actually very good about consulting with authors. So actually tomorrow, Sheila Gilbert from DAW is going to be calling me to talk about the cover for my next book coming out in next September, World Shaper. And in the past, I've gotten covers and I get a chance to comment on them. So, there was one cover that we had 3 or 4 different versions before we settled on something. So it's not that I'm picking the artists, they're picking artists. And one of the nice things about traditional publishers is they're able to draw on the best artists in the field. So I've had Stefan Martiniere, who's one of the greats in science fiction cover art, twice now, and people like that. But yeah, it depends. There are I've heard from other publishers, other authors with other publishers, that they get no say whatsoever. So it's very much a publisher by publisher thing.
Yeah, I can speak to that too, that I was very, very fortunate. My publisher worked with me in conjunction to design a cover that we both really liked. But I hear from countless friends that are traditionally published that they actually get sent their cover and, do you like it? I hope so, So I think it really depends on the publisher. And you can also have your agent, put an inclusion of a phrase that says basically that you have to have final approval of the cover. So there's a lot of wiggle room there, but I think most publishers really want their authors to be happy. So they do try and please you if you don't like a certain color or a different, font or something, to fix it up.
But if you do get a bad cover, you have something to talk about every time you do a reading from then on. She can hold it up and say, look at this awful cover, which I've done. So not with DAW books, but with a different publisher.
That's a good icebreaker right there. I know I've seen, and I can't remember her imprint, but I believe it was Jackson Pierce, who was a YA author. I think at some point she had a YouTube channel where she had uploaded a video talking about how frustrating it is with her particular publisher, whoever they were, that they didn't really ask and they would just send her the cover. And a lot of the time she felt it didn't really represent the book that well, but it was a cover that would sell. So it was kind of frustrating for her. So good to hear that not every traditional publisher is like that. And that you can maybe work with your literary agent or the contractor or whatever to fix that.
But just ultimately, of course, the cover is a marketing tool, and so that does fall into the publisher's wheelhouse, not the author's, really. So they have to put a cover on it that they think will sell in bookstores.
That's a good point. Yeah, very true. We do have another question here from Antonio, and he says, has either side made things difficult for the other side directly at some point? I know Joshua already mentioned how the market can be oversaturated, but are there other ways that it can be, that one side makes it more difficult for the other?
I think it's kind of unfair sometimes that the traditional publishers have a lot of access to very good reviews with Kirkus and Booklist and other, whereas there might be some phenomenal indie published people who might struggle to get a review from them. And I think that, it's too bad, because it's certainly where you're published does not reflect the quality of your book. And I love to see that they're making some strides in that area with reviews, but it's still a bit of a challenge, I think, for indie publishers, authors, sorry. Maybe our indie authors can speak to that.
It's definitely hard to get reviews. I think that that's something that I see every indie author struggle with, where they're constantly asking, and now we see issues where reviews are being removed regularly because we only have so much reach. And oftentimes, this is a touchy topic for a lot of authors too, but we make connections with a lot of our fans through social media, and we connect with them and we talk to them and we try to essentially solidify those relationships so that we can sell the next book and continue growing as an author. But we hear through the grapevine those reviews are then removed because people see that we have those connections with those people online. And I wouldn't say that we're friends with every fan that we have, but they're perceived that way, so people are just leaving us reviews because we're friends with them through social media. I don't know how much truth is in all of that, but that's what you hear through the grapevine with a lot of authors. Another thing that I think that we probably do to how we make it difficult for traditional writers, KJ was talking about this a little bit, about how there's the risk of losing a contract when sales aren't there, and indie authors are definitely stealing from the pot of traditional publishers. We put out so much content and so quickly and have so much information out there that I think that we oftentimes are robbing the pot of what traditional publishers would typically be making, just because there's so much content that's out there, which I know kind of goes to the oversaturation piece. But it's a concern that I've had is, how much are we stealing from the people that have the backing and have made it through the door, and then they're being shoved back out again because they can't make the sales.
And Joshua, just to jump in on that one too, pricing is a humongous issue in the world today for traditional authors. Indie authors can set their own pricing, whereas we're at the mercy of our publishers. And a lot of traditional authors talk about this, that it's very challenging. Someone who's never heard of two different authors, and one ebook is $12.99 and one's $3.99. Generally, they'll probably risk the unknown author on the $3.99. So it becomes a real challenge.
Which we see that too with wide distribution. I've just recently got my books out into wide distribution, and it jumped all the prices up by $4 or $5 per book from what I was selling them at before. Sales plummeted. I mean, print books went down as soon as that price went up, which was kind of frustrating too, because before people were buying those print books all the time. Once it went into wide distribution, I had to pay for it, and it spikes up on its own. You don't make the same sales. I don't know if that answered the question, Christy. We're just chatting.
That's how it should be. Great. Okay. Thank you guys so much. We're actually exactly at 9 o'clock. How rare is it that I can end one of these episodes in exactly an hour? We always joke about that. That always ends up going at least 15 minutes over. So Thank you very much to everyone in the audience. You guys have been awesome tonight. It's been a really fun chat, and you asked great questions. And thank you to all of our panelists. And stay tuned, because they're each going to tell you where you can find them. So let's go down the line again, just like we did last time. And please tell our audience where they can find you. Let's start with Kristina.
All right. Well, you can find me at myname.com. So KristinaRienzi.com. I am linked to everything there. My books are sold on almost all platforms. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram actively. I am also on YouTube. I'm trying to build my channel there, but I haven't done as much as I'd like. But yeah, KristinaRienzi.com is where everything lives. So hope to hear from you guys.
Thanks, Kristina. And next, KJ.
Well, sure. I'm at kjhowe.com, and then also on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at kjhoweauthor. And you can also contact me via Thrillerfest. My email is on the Thrillerfest website. And, just to let people know, the International Thriller Writers, we're here to support thriller authors. So if you would like to reach out, whether you're indie, traditional, anything, and need some help with something, just let me know, please.
Great. Thank you so much, KJ. And next, Joshua.
All right, my name is Joshua Robertson. You can find me at robertsonwrites.com. That's ROBERTSONWRITES. I just updated the site, so everybody go visit it and look how lovely it is. You can find all my connections there on there, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, etc., as well as a link to get into my Facebook group where I do live readings and question and answers every Wednesday night. What else? Oh, anybody that wanted to send me a beanie, you can also get my P.O. box on there. So send them to me. I'll do an unboxing on my YouTube channel. Thanks for having me, Christy. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks, Joshua. And I've seen his site update. It looks fantastic. So you guys definitely got to go check that out. And last but not least, of course, Ed.
I'm at edwardwillett.com. The important thing is to note that there are 2 T's on Willett. That's the most common misspelling. Edward, WILLETT.com. And again, you can find my other links from there. I'm on Twitter at @ewillett. Facebook. You can also find me at ecblake.com, because that's one of my pseudonyms. And I'm also on Facebook as EC Blake and on Twitter as author EC Blake. So we didn't talk about pseudonyms, but that's a whole other thing. But edwardwillett.com will lead you to everything else.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for being here. And I'm your host, Christy Stratus. You can find me at christystratus.com. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, lots of different places. YouTube. I have another YouTube channel called, it's just youtube.com/Christy Stratus. I am doing NaNoWriMo vlogs almost every day and sometimes live streams as well. And the next Writer's Edge is going to be in December. We will have one in December. I have not picked a date yet, but as you know, you can subscribe to us right here, and the live stream video will come up when we have it all set. And also, you can follow us or like us on Facebook now, The Writer's Edge Show. So definitely be sure to check us out there. So I'm looking forward to the next one. And this one was awesome. Thank you so much to the entire panel. You guys were fantastic. And thank you to our audience. We will be back again next month. So thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Christy.